It was one of those sweltering summer afternoons where even the air seemed heavy, pressing against your skin like a physical weight. I had decided to take a walk through the small park near my apartment, hoping the shade of the old oaks would offer some relief from the relentless heat. I never expected that a simple, ordinary stroll would become the kind of day I would replay in my mind over and over again. That I had barely made it past the fountain when I saw him, Alex. He was leaning casually against the low stone wall, his shirt clinging to his back from the heat, the top buttons undone as though inviting the sunlight to touch his skin. His presence had a way of drawing the eye, even from across the park, not just because of his physicality, but because of the quiet confidence in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself. That I tried to focus on my own path, forcing my eyes to the ground, but it was impossible. Something about him demanded attention. Perhaps it was the way he ran a hand through his dark hair, or the way a faint smile lingered at the corner of his lips, as if he had just witnessed a private joke no one else could understand. I told myself to look away, reminded myself that I had a life, responsibilities, and boundaries, but the thought barely registered. As I approached the small clearing, I noticed Alex removing his shirt completely, tossing it carelessly to one side. The motion was casual, mundane even, but it made my heart skip in ways I hadn't expected. I felt a jolt of something unfamiliar, an undeniable pull I wasn't ready to name. I quickly reminded myself to breathe, to focus on the trees, the fountain, the distant sound of children playing. But every time my gaze shifted back, he was there, almost oblivious to the effect he was having, and yet somehow completely aware that it wasn't just the physical appeal, it was the ease with which he existed in the world. I watched him take a long sip from his water bottle, droplets clinging to the smooth lines of his collarbone. The heat hadn't fazed him. He seemed alive in a way I could feel from a distance, and I realized with a twinge of guilt that I was drawn not only to his appearance but to his energy, his presence. That I knew I should have turned away. I should have respected the boundaries that life and circumstance had laid down for me. But curiosity, and something deeper that I didn't yet understand, kept me rooted where I was. It was the kind of attraction that was instantaneous, visceral, impossible to ignore. My thoughts were a tangle of rationality and desire, a tightrope I didn't want to walk, but couldn't stop myself from trying. As I watched him, Alex glanced my way, just briefly, but it was enough. I felt a flutter in my chest, a connection that didn't require words. He smiled, and for a moment, the heat, the park, the people around us, all of it faded. It was as though the world had narrowed down to the space between us. Then he straightened, readjusting the towel slung over his shoulders, and started walking in my direction. My pulse quickened, though I tried to steady it. I reminded myself that nothing had happened, nothing was promised, and yet the tension between us was undeniable. Something had shifted in that fleeting glance, in the shared awareness of the other's presence. That I continued walking, but my mind lingered on him, on that unexpected spark that had ignited so quickly. The rest of the park blurred into insignificance. All I could think about was Alex, about the unplanned moment that had already begun to change the rhythm of my day. I didn't know what would happen next, but I sensed, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that nothing about today would remain ordinary, and in that instant, I understood something unsettling. Sometimes, the most unplanned encounters leave the deepest marks. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls, but beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler. I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion, confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired, and as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something neither of us could control. The moment lingered longer than it should have. Our fingers had touched, our eyes locked, and in that instant, the world around us ceased to exist. I could feel the weight of everything I had tried to control, the boundaries, the logic, the moral compass, slipping away, replaced by a dizzying mix of desire, curiosity, and fear. Alex looked at me with a vulnerability I hadn't expected, and in that gaze, I saw the same hesitation mirrored in myself that we didn't speak immediately. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, we continued walking side by side, the silence heavy yet comforting, the unspoken acknowledgement of our growing connection hanging between us like a fragile thread. I could feel my heart racing, a mixture of exhilaration and dread, knowing that once the thread was pulled, nothing would be the same. Later, we found ourselves at a quiet corner of the park, away from the prying eyes of passers-by. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows and painting the sky in warm hues of gold and orange. Alex stopped, turning toward me, his expression open yet guarded. "I didn't plan for any of this," he admitted softly, his voice barely above the rustle of the leaves. "I don't know where this is going." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Neither do I whispered, my words trembling. The truth was, I had wanted this and feared it all at once. The attraction, the connection, the intensity, it had built slowly, subtly, and now it demanded acknowledgement. But I can't ignore it, I added, the admission both frightening and liberating that we stood there for a long moment, neither moving closer nor stepping away. The moral lines I had always relied on blurred under the weight of raw emotion. I felt guilt prick at the edges of my mind, yet it was mingled with a deep, undeniable pull toward him. I knew that whatever happened between us would not be simple, that it would ripple through my life and challenge everything I thought I knew about loyalty and desire, and yet, in that quiet space, there was a strange clarity. I realized that connections like this, unexpected, unplanned, intense, were part of the human experience. They tested us, pushed us, and sometimes forced us to confront truths we had avoided. With Alex, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was emotional, mental, something that seeped into the spaces where my heart had been locked tight. As the light softened, Alex smiled faintly, a mixture of mischief and tenderness. "We should take it slow," he said. "We don't know the consequences yet, and maybe that's okay." His words resonated, acknowledging both the risk and the thrill. I nodded, understanding that there was no clear path forward, only choices made in the moment and their aftermath. The walk back was quiet, but the tension had transformed. It was no longer urgent or chaotic, it was thoughtful, reflective, charged with potential. I realized that what had begun as an accidental attraction had become something more profound, a connection that demanded attention, honesty, and careful consideration. By the time we parted ways, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because the moment had passed without chaos, anxiety because I knew this was only the beginning. I replayed our interactions in my mind, analyzing every glance, every gesture, and I understood that my life was subtly, irrevocably altered. As I reached my apartment, I paused by the door, taking a deep breath. The heat of the day had subsided, replaced by the quiet hum of evening. I reflected on what had happened, acknowledging the unplanned, the unexpected, the forbidden pull that had drawn me to Alex. I didn't have answers yet, and perhaps I never would, but I knew one thing with certainty: sometimes, the moments we never plan become the ones we remember most vividly. And as I stepped inside, I carried with me both the thrill and the caution of what had begun, a story that was still unfolding, one choice, one glance, and one heartbeat at a time. The days after Ethan's departure unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness. Daniel had always cherished silence, but now it felt different, sharper, almost accusing. Every corner of his apartment reminded him of what had transpired: the sofa where laughter had lingered, the table where secrets had been shared, the door where Ethan had stood, hesitant yet magnetic. Daniel returned to his routine, yet nothing felt routine anymore. He went to work, answered emails, exchanged polite nods with colleagues, but inside, a restless current pulled at him. It was not only longing that unsettled him, it was the realization of how quickly boundaries could dissolve when loneliness met temptation. One evening, he passed Ethan and Sophie in the hallway. They looked like any ordinary couple, her arm linked in his, their voices light as they discussed dinner plans. For a moment, Daniel wondered if Sophie suspected anything, or if Ethan had already buried their encounters under layers of normality. Ethan's eyes met Daniel's briefly. There was no smile this time, only a flicker of recognition before he looked away. The silence of that glance felt heavier than any word they had exchanged. Back in his apartment, Daniel sat by the window, watching streetlights flicker against wet pavement. He replayed the weeks in his mind, the unexpected knock, the nights of wine and laughter, the confessions whispered in the shadows. Each memory carried both warmth and weight, sweetness and sorrow. He realized he had been both chosen and used, cherished and compromised. The temptation to reach out to Ethan tugged at him in quiet moments. He would catch himself drafting unsent messages, his fingers hovering over words he knew he should never send. "Are you okay? Do you think of me? Was it real?" But he deleted them all, reminding himself of the promise he had made, not just to Ethan, but to himself. Instead, Daniel began to rebuild. He forced himself back into small routines that grounded him, morning jogs along the Thames, afternoons spent in bookshops, evenings journaling his thoughts. Writing became a release, a way to untangle the web of emotions he had been too afraid to name out loud. On paper, he admitted what he could not say to anyone else, that he had been complicit, that he had wanted something forbidden, that love and betrayal often walk side by side, yet with every page, he also discovered clarity. He was not defined solely by what had happened with Ethan. The affair had left scars, yes, but it had also awakened him to his own capacity for love, desire, and choice. He had touched fire and survived. Weeks later, Daniel found himself sitting in a cafe, watching the world through fogged glass. A stranger at the next table smiled at him, a simple, uncalculated smile. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to smile back without guilt. It did not carry the weight of secrecy or the thrill of betrayal, it was ordinary, and that made it feel extraordinary. That night, he returned home lighter than he had in months. He thought about Ethan less and less, until his memory became a quiet echo rather than a storm. Sometimes he still wondered what might have been if they had chosen differently, but he no longer let that question consume him. The answer, he realized, did not matter. What mattered was the lesson, that true connection must be built on truth, not shadows. As autumn gave way to winter, Daniel closed the chapter firmly. The silence of his apartment no longer accused him, it comforted him again, as it once had. He understood now that solitude was not emptiness, but space to heal, to grow, to wait for something that would not ask him to compromise his conscience. In the quiet, he whispered a final thought, not to Ethan, not to Sophie, but to himself: I will not let betrayal define me. I will find a love that